Beg me." She said it to a duke. He laughed once, the kind of short, hard sound men of his rank made when they had not yet understood that a thing was real. And then his laughter folded in on itself and went quiet. Because Lady Cordelia Whitlock had not blinked. She stood behind her late husband's desk in a gown the color of crushed sapphires, the fire at her back, and she held in her gloved hand a folded letter sealed in black wax. She turned the seal toward him so that he could see whose mark it was. The Duke of Ravenholm, who had ridden across 2 counties at dawn to demand that letter as if it were already his, took 1 half-step forward and then did not take a second. "My lady," he said, "beg me, your grace." He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders in a way that no London tailor had ever quite managed to soften, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with the look of someone who had spent the last fortnight not sleeping. His travelling coat was wet at the hem. His boots had left a perfect dark print on her hall carpet. He had introduced himself in her doorway by saying, "I have come for the Whitlock letter, madam, and I shall have it before noon." And Cordelia, who had been awake since 4 and was on her 3rd cup of bitter tea, had simply gestured him into the study without speaking, set the letter on the blotter, and rested 2 fingertips on top of it as if it were a pinned moth. Now he looked at the letter, and then at her hand, and then at her face, and his jaw worked. "You forget yourself, madam." "On the contrary," she said, "I remember myself very clearly. It is you who have arrived at my door in mud and given orders. The letter is mine. It was written to my husband. It was kept in my husband's drawer. He has been dead 7 months, your grace, and I have read every word of it. So when I say beg me, I mean ask. I mean phrase it as a request. I mean acknowledge, in the form your nursemaid taught you before you could shave, that there is another human being on this side of the desk." "I am not in the habit of asking." "Then learn the habit. I have all morning." His knuckles had gone white where they rested on the back of the chair he had not been invited to take. There was a clock somewhere behind him ticking with offensive calm. From the kitchen below them came the very small, ordinary sound of Mrs. Ferring scolding a parlour-maid for over-honeying the toast. Sebastian Avery, 9th Duke of Ravenholm, master of 40,000 acres and 7 seats, and 1 badly cracked reputation, did not beg. He had not begged at 7, when his father had locked him in the gun-room without a candle. He had not begged at 16, when his tutor had broken his hand for an answer too quick. He had not begged at 23, when his elder brother Edmund, the gentle one, the bookish one, the one the family had always preferred, had died slowly of a wasting illness in a bedroom across the corridor, and half of London had begun to whisper that Sebastian had hurried him along. He had not begged then, when the whispers cost him his closest friend, his betrothal, and very nearly his seat in the Lords. He was not going to begin now, on a Tuesday in late May, in a Hampshire widow's study, over a single folded sheet. "My lady," he said again, and this time the word came out with a careful softness he had clearly not intended. "If I have offended you, that was not my object. The letter touches a matter on which Parliament will rule in a fortnight. My brother wrote it on the last day he was lucid. It is the only document that proves what was done to him was not done by my hand. I have ridden through the night. I have not eaten. I have spoken to no one in this county yet but you. I am asking you for it. I am asking you civilly." Cordelia watched him. She had heard 1,000 men ask for 1,000 things civilly. Most of them had been ready to take what they asked for the moment the asking failed. There was a way a man's weight shifted in his boots when he was telling himself, very quietly, that if civility did not work, he would still leave the room with the thing in his hand. She watched the Duke's weight. He did not shift. That, more than anything else he had said, made her hesitate. She did not lift her fingers from the letter. "That," she said, "was not begging. That was bargaining wearing manners. But it was nearer the mark than the first attempt, so I shall return the favour. Sit down, Your Grace. Mrs. Ferring will bring you bread and cold beef. You will eat. You will then tell me, in your own words, and not in the words your solicitor put in your mouth on the ride down, what you believe happened to your brother Edmund in the spring of 1814. When you have finished, I will decide what to do with this letter. You will decide. I will decide. The letter is in my house, and I am its widow's heir, in this much at least. If you would prefer to ride back to London and read of your defeat in the Times, the road is the way you came in. For one long second, she thought he might refuse. His shoulders had set the way a horse is set before it bolted. Then, with the slow, careful movement of a man whose pride had been told to sit down and obey, he pulled out the chair on the visitor's side of the desk, sat in it, and removed his gloves. "Bread," he said, "and cold beef. And tea, if your housekeeper would oblige." She would. She has. The door behind him opened on cue, and Mrs. Ferring, a small grey woman with the build of a determined sparrow, swept in with a tray and an expression that suggested she would have been disappointed in him personally if he had walked out. Cordelia waited until he had taken the first bite of the beef before she sat down opposite him, folded her hands beside the letter, and said, with the same level voice she had used to refuse him, "Begin at the spring." The thing about being a barrister's widow, Cordelia had learned in the last 7 months, was that the world did not quite know what to do with you. It expected you to fold up small and dim, to wear the dyes of mourning past the period the dyes were due, to refuse invitations on the grounds that you had nothing left to offer. The world had not asked her, before assigning her this part, whether the part fit. It did not fit. James Whitlock, King's Counsel, late of Lincoln's Inn, husband of 7 good years and friend of 15 before that, had not married a woman who folded. He had married a woman who, at the age of 22, had argued him out of taking a brief that would have made his name and broken 3 families, and who had, at 25, helped him assemble the case that finally crushed the Welby shipping ring. James had loved her for that. He had also, in the final months, when the cough would not let him cross a room, asked her to promise him 2 things. Keep the work going where she could, and keep his correspondence, all of it, locked, until she had read every word. She had read every word. She knew, therefore, what was in the Duke of Ravenholm's letter, and she knew what was not in it, and she knew which parliamentary committee was about to hear from a Lord Ashbourne who hated the Ravenholm name on grounds older than this scandal. She had not, however, intended to receive his grace before luncheon. She had intended to put on a riding habit at 11, take the brown mare out as far as the river, and think. He had ruined that plan by arriving at 9:30. She watched him now, over the rim of her cup. He was eating slowly, in the manner of a man who had not realized how hungry he was until the food was in front of him. There was a small white scar near his temple she had not noticed in the doorway. There were violet shadows under his eyes that the candlelight did not flatter. He was, she conceded reluctantly, a handsome man. The kind of handsome that newspaper caricaturists liked, because it gave them something to draw. The kind of handsome that an aunt of hers would have called dangerous, and an uncle would have called useful, and her husband would simply have called, with the dry note he used for the obvious, trouble. He was finishing the beef. "My brother," he said, without looking up, "was already failing when our father called me home in February of 14. I had been on the continent. There had been a quarrel. I shall not pretend it was small. He had refused a marriage I had wanted, and I had said things to him that I did not have time to take back." He turned the cup in his hands. The tea inside it had stopped steaming. By the time I reached the house, he could not hold a pen for more than 3 minutes. He could speak. He spoke a great deal in the last month, mostly to me, mostly at 4 in the morning when he could not sleep. He asked me to forgive him for the quarrel. I asked him to forgive me. We forgave each other. We were close again. The fire popped, sending a small constellation of red against the iron of the grate. Cordelia did not interrupt. Whatever London says of those weeks is wrong, and it is wrong in every direction, including the directions that flatter me. I did not poison him. I did not hurry him. I sat in a chair by his bed and held his hand and read to him from a book of Donne's sermons that he had loved at Oxford. On the 7th of April, he was gone. He went of the same wasting our mother went of, and our grandmother before her. There is no mystery in it, except to people who like a mystery better than a sad fact. He set down the knife. On the 6th of April, he sent for your husband. They had been at school together. They corresponded all their lives. I was in the corridor. He dictated a letter for an hour. He sealed it with his own hands. He told my valet to ride with it himself. I knew the letter existed. I did not know what was in it. He died the next morning, and I have spent 3 years not asking, because asking would have looked like a man covering a crime. Last month, Ashbourne's faction decided that the absence of any explanation from me was, in itself, an explanation. They have moved a private inquiry. It opens a fortnight from this morning. If your husband's letter contains anything Edmund wrote about me with his own hand, it is the only voice in the matter that no one in London can dismiss. He looked up at her then. His dark eyes had a peculiar steadiness in them, like the steadiness of a man who had already counted the cost of losing. That is what I believe. That is what I know. That is what I came here to say. I would have said it without the bread and beef. Cordelia sat very still. Why, she said finally, did you order me then? At the door? Because, he said, I did not know, until you put your hand on the letter and refused me, that the letter was in the keeping of a woman who could read what was in it. I knew there was a widow. I assumed that the widow had locked her husband's papers in a strong-box and forgotten the key. I assumed I would be informing her, kindly, that the letter mattered. I assumed wrong. I apologize. Bluntly, I am told I have no other mode. You are told correctly, she said, and despite herself, despite the mourning, despite the carpet that would need beating, she felt the corner of her mouth lift. He saw it. He filed it. He did not, to his credit, smile back. My lady, he said, may I see the letter? You may not. Then you may sit, she said, and you may listen, and I will read to you the parts of it that I have decided you may hear today. The remainder belongs to my husband's clients, of whom your brother was one, and they will hear it on the day Parliament hears it. Do we agree? A pause. He inclined his head. She lifted her fingers from the seal. She broke it carefully, although she had read the letter a dozen times and knew where every breath in it lived, because the breaking was its own kind of theatre, and she had decided he should feel it. The wax cracked. The paper opened. Her husband's neat black hand and another, larger hand that had clearly been writing through a tremor met on the page in alternating lines. She read, My dear Whitlock, I dictate this to your good office because I have no other office in the world I trust as much. Sebastian is in the corridor and does not know I write. I have asked him to forgive me, and he has forgiven me, but I have not yet been able to say to him what is in this letter, and I am afraid I shall not be able to. So I leave it with you, and with your wife, of whom I have heard you speak with such pride that I wish I had known her in life. I leave it under one condition. It is to be opened by no one until the matter of my dying becomes a matter of law. She paused. Across the desk, the Duke of Ravenholm had gone very still. My brother, he said, wrote that. Your brother dictated that. The hand of writing is my husband's. The next paragraph is in your brother's own hand. He took the pen for it. I shall read it as written. It is, I should warn you, not what you came here for. What did I come here for? You came here for a letter that exonerates you of poisoning. The letter contains far more than that. Brace, please. He braced. He did not move, but she could see the bracing in the line of his shoulders. The way a man bracing in a saddle for a jump did not move, but became, instead, a different shape. She read on. I am told my time is shorter than I had wished. I had wished to live until autumn. I had wished to introduce my brother Sebastian to a woman who would not let him be himself entirely unchallenged, which is the only kind of woman who could love him without harm to both. I had wished to see Whitlock's wife once more. None of these are things I am to have. So I do the next best thing. I make a disposition. The contingent estates of Ravenholm, Marland, Halford, and the small island farm at Rye were never tied to the title. They are mine to give. I give them, on my death, to such person as the Whitlock office shall, in its sole and undelegable discretion, name as their lawful heir, in trust for the public good as that office sees fit. Sebastian will inherit the dukedom and Ravenholm itself, which is what he is fit for and what he loves. The contingent estates I leave in better hands than mine. The Duke of Ravenholm closed his eyes. He gave them away, he said. He gave them, she corrected gently, into trust, to my husband's office. To your husband, who is dead. To the office. The office's discretion did not die with my husband. My husband, on his own deathbed, named the person in whom the discretion was to vest. He left, with our solicitor, an instrument of appointment. He sealed it. The instrument was opened last week. The discretion now rests with one person in the kingdom. Who? With me. She set the letter down on the blotter, very gently, with both hands, in the way she might have set down a sleeping child. The fire popped behind her. The clock on the mantel decided it was 10. So you see, Your Grace, she said, in a voice that was no longer steel, and no longer mocking, and no longer, exactly, the voice of a woman behind a desk. The letter is what it is. It will, on the appointed day, prove that your brother died in your love. It will also prove that he took 3 estates out of your hand and put them in mine, and I have not yet decided what to do with them. So when I tell you to beg me, I mean it in a fuller sense than you understood when you came through the door. I mean ask. I mean ask, knowing the size of what you are asking. I mean ask, knowing that I am not your enemy, although I am also not yet exactly your friend. I mean, sit a moment longer, drink your tea, then think. For a long minute the Duke of Ravenholm did not move. Then he reached, slowly, for the cup, lifted it, and drank. Lady Whitlock, he said, may I come back tomorrow? You may, at an hour you choose. 11. At 11, then. I shall not arrive in mud. I should not have noticed if you did. You did notice. I noticed, she conceded. The carpet. He set the cup down. He stood. He bowed, properly this time, the bow of a man who has remembered that bowing is not a defeat, and he picked up his gloves from the desk and put them on. At the door, with one hand on the frame, he looked back at her over his shoulder. My lady, he said, I have, in my life, been asked to do a great many things. I have not, before today, been asked to think. I shall do my best with it. He left. She listened to his boots in the hall, and to the front door closing, and to the sound of his groom calling up his horse on the gravel, and to the horse going away at the slow, even pace of an animal whose rider had told it, quietly, that there was no need to hurry now. She did not cry. She did not laugh. She poured herself a 4th cup of bitter tea, picked up her late husband's letter, and read the 3rd paragraph, the one she had not read aloud, for the 13th time. The 3rd paragraph, in Edmund's hand, said this: Whitlock, if your wife is the woman you have described, and I think she is, then before she signs any instrument disposing of the contingent estates, my brother is to know her, and she is to know my brother. I do not insist on a marriage. I insist on a friendship. Sebastian has never had a friend who told him no. Find him one. Find me one. I am very tired. Cordelia folded the letter, locked it back into its drawer, walked to the window, and watched the rider become small at the bend of the lane. "All right, Edmund," she said. "All right." That afternoon, Cordelia walked alone in the long border behind the kitchen garden, where the lavender was still grey, but the columbines were beginning, and where the bees had remembered the rosemary. She had a habit, after a difficult morning, of taking the kitchen path slowly and counting things: the slates on the dairy roof, the apples on the cordon, the new leaves on the medlar. It was an old habit. Her grandmother had taught it to her on a similar afternoon in a similar garden when she had been 7. She counted today, the slates first, and then the columbines, and then, against her will, the number of times the Duke of Ravenholm's name had passed through her own mind between 2:30 and 4. She decided not to count further. The walled garden held its little warmth in its bricks, and gave it back to her in slow, steady ounces. She let it. By the time she came back into the house through the kitchen door, Mrs. Ferring had put away the breakfast service and laid the small tea for 2, and the parlour-maid had, with a discretion her age would not have suggested, dusted the chair the Duke had sat in. She returned, the Duke of Ravenholm, at 11:05 the following morning, in clean boots, on a black gelding, with a single book under his arm that he handed to her at the door without preamble. It was a worn copy of Donne's Sermons, with a slip of paper marking the page on which her husband, 20 years before, had written a small marginal note in his student hand. She looked at the note. She looked at him. "Where did you get this?" "From Edmund's shelf. I should have given it back to your husband. I shall, in time, ask your forgiveness for the delay. Today I bring it for you to keep, if you will." She kept it. That morning, they did not discuss the contingent estates. They discussed, instead, the riding habit she was wearing, a deep teal wool with brass buttons that he said, with no detectable irony, made her look regrettably impossible to overlook. They discussed the brown mare, who was, in Cordelia's account, an honest creature with no opinions, and, in the Duke's, a tolerant escort for a woman who, I am told, would rather argue with her horse than her host. They rode out as far as the river. They returned by way of the high field, where the hawthorn was in full flower, and the air smelled, ridiculously, of clean honey. He did not touch her. He did not, all morning, mention the inquiry, his brother, or the letter. By the time he handed her down from the saddle in her own yard at 1:02, she had laughed 3 times, twice at his expense, once at her own, and she had caught herself, just before he turned away, wanting to ask him whether he intended to come back the next day. She did not ask. He came back the next day at the same hour. He did not bring a book. He brought a question. "My lady," he said, when they were both on horseback again, and the brown mare had decided that the Duke's gelding was, on balance, an acceptable companion. "Do you know how much of London thinks I killed my brother?" "I have a fair idea." "Most. Most of London." "Yes." "My fiancé broke our engagement in March of 14. I have not, since then, been able to walk into a ballroom without watching the small movement of women's shoulders away. I have not been able to stand in the Lords without sensing the bench shift around me. I do not say this for pity. I say it because I have lived 3 years in a house everyone in the country believes is a murder house. I would like you to understand the weight of what your husband's letter unbuckles, so that you understand also why I asked, that first morning, and the tone I asked. I've been carrying it. I came to your door carrying it. I set it down at your feet without warning. That was wrong. I should have set it down somewhere else first." "On whom?" "Myself." "That," she said, looking carefully at the road between her mare's ears, "is the first useful thing you have said to me in 3 meetings. I'm told I have moments." "You have moments." He laughed. It startled the gelding, who tossed his head. The Duke quieted the horse and turned in his saddle and said, with a sudden plainness that she would later remember as the first crack in his armour. Lady Whitlock, I have not, in 3 years, laughed in the presence of a woman who has not paid to make me laugh. May I come back the day after tomorrow, and the day after that, and so on, until the inquiry is heard? You may. Without arranging a reason. Without arranging a reason. You have not asked me, he said, what I intend to ask you in the end. I know, she said, what you intend to ask. You intend to ask me to assign the contingent estates back to the Ravenholm line. I do. And you have not yet asked it? No, I have decided, he said, with a thin, precise smile, to take my late brother's advice. He left a note, did he not, in the 3rd paragraph? She looked at him. You guessed? I guessed. Edmund did not leave anything to chance. If he gave you a stick large enough to beat me with, he also gave you a reason not to beat me with it. He would have wanted us, I think, to know each other a little first. You read your brother well. I read him too late. I shall not read you too late, my lady, if you will permit me. She did not, in that moment, answer. But when the gelding moved on, and the brown mare followed without prompting, and the May sun came through the hawthorn in long, slanting bars onto the lane, she found that she was riding side by side with the Duke of Ravenholm, at a deliberate pace, and that neither of them had ridden ahead. A bee passed between the 2 horses. A wood pigeon from the elm at the next gate made its slow, soft remark on the weather. Somewhere across the field, in a hedge, a blackbird settled an old quarrel with a thrush. The lane bent. They did not speak again until the river. At the river, the brown mare lowered her head to drink. The gelding waited. The Duke of Ravenholm watched the water. Cordelia watched the Duke. She had, in her childhood, been told by an aunt that the only safe way to learn a man's character was to ride beside him for half an hour without conversation. The aunt had been, in many particulars, an unreliable woman. In this particular, Cordelia decided, the aunt had been right. Mrs. Ferring was, on the matter of the Duke, an unrepentant gossip. 3 mornings now, my lady, she said, on the 4th morning, beating egg yolks into a yellow froth with a vigour the eggs did not quite deserve. And the staff have begun to lay out a 3rd place at the small table whether I ask them or not. He has not asked to stay for breakfast. He has not asked. The staff have decided. The staff, she added darkly, are romantic. The staff are mistaken. The staff, said Mrs. Ferring, have eyes, as do I. The mare canters out of the yard with him in a way she has never cantered out with the late master, may he rest. And that is not a comment on the late master, who was a gentleman. That is a comment on the mare. Mrs. Ferring, I beg pardon, my lady. I shall say no more. She said a great deal more. She said it through buttering toast, and through pressing the brown mare's saddle blanket flat, and through arranging in the dining room a small bowl of hawthorn blossom that nobody had asked for. She said it in the tone of a woman who knew that a widow of 26, who laughed in a hallway 3 mornings running, was a widow whom the household would not, in good conscience, allow to be alone. Cordelia, who had grown up under the eyes of 2 older sisters and a grandmother with an opinion on every subject, accepted the management without comment. At 11, the Duke arrived. He had brought, this time, 2 books, one for her, a slim octavo of a poet she had not read, one for himself, in case she sent him to a corner and refused to speak. He had brought, in addition, a small wrapped parcel, which he set on the hall table, removed his gloves over, and then handed to her with no comment. She opened it. It was a pair of riding gloves, fawn leather, cut for a woman's hand. They were not new. They were, very clearly, of expensive make and of careful use. They were my mother's, he said. She had small hands. Yours, I observed yesterday, as smaller than the gloves you have been wearing, which are your husband's. I should like, with your permission, to see you in gloves cut for you. They are also, before you remark on it, not a courting gift. They are a gift of acknowledgement. The mare is hard on a woman's grip. She drew the gloves on slowly. They fit. They fit, as gloves fit only when their original wearer's hand was an unusual shape, and the new wearer's hand was the same unusual shape. She looked at him. "Your Grace," she said. "My lady." "I shall ride out with you in these gloves. I shall not, however, accept them." "You shall accept them." "I shall not." "You shall. Because if you do not, my mother's gloves go back into a drawer in a house she has not lived in for 20 years, and there is no woman in the world for whose hand they were cut, except yours. They are useless to me. They are not useless to you. I am, in this matter, a man of small economies. Accept them." "You are not a man of small economies." "Today I am." She laughed. She let herself laugh. She tucked the parcel paper into the hall table drawer, where she kept ribbons and odd buttons, and she went out to the yard with him in her late mother-in-law's gloves and her own teal habit, and the staff watched from the window in a small, respectful clump, and Mrs. Ferring, behind them, declined, on principle, to look. They rode that day to the village. She had not, in 7 months of mourning, ridden to the village. James's death was still a recent matter on the road into Marland, and the cottagers had a way of removing their hats from a half-mile off that she had not, yet, found a way to receive without crying. The Duke did not know that. She did not tell him. They simply rode, and at the bridge the first cottager removed his hat, and at the second cottage a small girl ran to the gate with a fistful of cowslips and pushed them through the bars at the height of Cordelia's stirrup. And Cordelia, without warning to herself, bent down from the saddle, took the cowslips, and said, "Thank you, Anne. Thank you, dear," in a voice that did not break, but went thin at the edges. The Duke of Ravenholm rode on a length ahead, and pretended to be interested in a thatch. When she had her face back, and the cowslips tucked into the throat of her habit, and the small girl had been waved on her way with another shilling than she had been expecting, Cordelia caught him up at the next gate, and said, without turning her head, "Thank you, Your Grace." "For what?" "For not looking at me." "My lady," he said, "in 3 years I have learned the value of not being looked at when a thing has just opened. I shall do you the same courtesy whenever it is needed." "That is the second useful thing you have said to me." "I am building a small collection." "Continue." He did. By the time they returned to the yard at 2 o'clock, he had said 4 more useful things, 3 foolish ones, and one which she suspected was the beginning of an apology that she did not yet want to hear in full. Mrs. Ferring met them at the door with a plate of bread and cheese, and a glance that the Duke, who was a man of small economies after all, returned with a small bow as he handed over his hat. "Mrs. Ferring." "Your Grace?" "I have ridden your mistress hard today. She is to be given the largest piece of cheese." "The largest piece, Your Grace, is already on her plate." "Then I am, as ever, redundant. I shall take the second largest." He took the second largest. He left at 3, with his book under his arm, and Cordelia, climbing the stairs to her own dressing room, paused on the landing because she did not, for one curious second, remember whether the morning had been a Tuesday or a Thursday, and realized, with a kind of small interior shock, that she had not thought about James between the cottager's hat and the second piece of cheese. She thought about James very carefully, then. She thought about him for some time. She decided he would have liked the Duke of Ravenholm. She decided he would have told her so. Then she went to dress for supper. The trouble arrived, as trouble at country houses always arrived, in a calling card. It was the morning of the 7th day. The Duke had not yet come. Mrs. Ferring brought up the card on the silver tray with an expression that suggested the morning's eggs would be the only pleasant thing about the next hour.
"The Earl of Ashbourne, my lady." Now.
Cordelia looked at the card. It was thick. It was engraved. It said nothing more than the Earl's name, but it might as well have said the words on the reverse out loud.
"Show his lordship into the drawing room, please. I shall be down."
She was not down at once. She finished her tea. She washed her hands. She changed her morning cap for a plainer one, on the principle that vanity in front of an enemy was always a mistake. She put the Duke's mother's gloves into the bottom drawer of her dressing table, because she did not want a stray ribbon of them on her sleeve when the Earl looked at her hands. Then she went down. The Earl of Ashbourne was a thin, grey man of about 50, with the kind of face that looked, even in repose, as if it were preparing to be displeased. He had been a friend of Cordelia's father in her childhood. He had, in adulthood, opposed 3 of her late husband's most important briefs. He stood when she came in, and inclined his head, and Cordelia, who knew him, did not offer her hand.
"My lord?"
"Lady Whitlock?"
"You are well, I trust?"
"As well as the season permits. I've come on a matter of business."
"Sit then."
He sat. He did not look at the chair. He looked at her. "My dear," he said, in the tone of a man who had decided in advance that endearments would work on her better than facts. "I had not intended to disturb your morning. I would not, ordinarily, call on a recent widow in her own house in the morning. The matter, however, is not one that will keep."
"Speak it, then."
"The Duke of Ravenholm has been seen, 3 mornings in succession, at your gate."
"4."
"4. Thank you for the correction. He is engaged, as I think you know, in a private matter before a committee of the House. I am the chair of that committee. It would be improper if it were said in town that the chairman's witness, the witness whose father's office holds the contingent papers, was being courted by the principal. I am not a witness. You will be a witness. I will not. My husband's office will produce its papers and its instrument of appointment and read them in the order required. I do not need to appear in person. You will appear in person." She watched him. "My lord," she said, "are you instructing me as to where I am to appear?" "I am suggesting to you," he said, with the very slight smile of a man who knew the difference between instructing and suggesting, and intended the listener to know it also, "that the gentleman who has been riding to your gate is not a gentleman whose company a recent widow should be seen to keep. There are persons in London, I shall not name them, who have asked me, on hearing of his visits, whether the office of Solicitor Whitlock is to be regarded as having compromised itself." "By what?" "By favor." "I see." She did see. She saw it very clearly. The Earl had come not to threaten her. That would have come later, but to plant a small phrase in her ear that he could later say, on his honor, he had given her warning of. The phrase would, in 3 days, be in 3 London drawing rooms, in 5 in print. By the day of the inquiry, the air around the Whitlock office would be discolored. The instrument of appointment, when produced, would arrive in a room already half persuaded that the office was compromised. The contingent estates, by a small and entirely natural-seeming chain of events, would slip back into the disposal of the committee, of which the Earl of Ashbourne was the chair. The Earl had not come to ask her to dismiss the Duke. He had come to make sure that the very act of being seen with the Duke became, by itself, the dismissal of her credit. It was a small, clean piece of malice. She admired it briefly, in the way one admired the design of a snare that had only just missed one's ankle.
"My lord," she said, "may I speak plainly?"
"All wait." "The Duke of Ravenholm has called on me 4 mornings. We have written. We have spoken of the weather, of his late mother, of my late husband, and of a small girl in Marland village whose name is Anne. We have not spoken of the inquiry, of the contingent estates, of the committee, of the chair of the committee, or of you." He has not asked me to do anything. I have not promised him anything. If, in 3 days, you hear in a London drawing room that the office of Whitlock is compromised, I should be greatly obliged if you would correct the speaker, since you are the only person in this house this morning who has used the word." The Earl's mouth, which had been pleased, became briefly tight. "My dear, I am not your dear, my lord. I am Lady Whitlock. I am Lady Whitlock until I am Lady something else, which I have not, at present, any intention of being." "You will, however, attend the inquiry." "I shall consider it." "I shall expect you." "You may expect," she said, "whatever you wish. The roads of England are public. The chambers of Parliament, on a day of an open inquiry, are also public. Whether I attend is a matter for me." "My lady, my lord, I shall ring for your hat." She rang. Mrs. Ferring, who had been listening at the door, Cordelia knew because she could hear, on the other side, the very small, careful sound of Mrs. Ferring not breathing, opened the door at the 3rd ring, took the Earl's hat from the side table with the slow deliberation of a woman handing a weapon back to an enemy, and presented it to him. "My lord." "Mrs. Ferring." The Earl took his hat. He bowed. He left. Cordelia stood for a moment in the drawing room, looking at the chair he had sat in. Then she went into the hall, opened the front door herself, and stood on the step until the Earl's curricle had taken the bend at the lane. When the wheels were no longer audible, she walked back through the house to the morning room, sat at her writing desk, drew a sheet of paper, and dipped her pen. She wrote 2 letters. One to the Duke of Ravenholm. "Your Grace, the Earl of Ashbourne has called. Pray come at noon." One to her late husband's office in Lincoln's Inn. "Mr. Carstairs, bring the instrument. Bring my husband's seal. The Dunn letter is here in my drawer. I shall have it ready. We have a week." She sealed both. She rang for the postboy. By the time the postboy was clattering away down the lane, the Duke's gelding was already a black speck on the rise at the far end of the parish, and Cordelia, watching from the window with the new gloves once again on her hands, said softly to the empty room, "There you are." He came in without his hat. He had ridden hard. There were fresh flecks on his coat, and his hair was disordered, and he was, as he came through the door of the morning room, already speaking. "What did he say to you?" "Sit down." "What did he say?" "Sit down, Your Grace, and I shall tell you." He sat down. He did not, this time, take off his gloves. He was leaning forward in the chair, with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on hers, and the small, unguarded line of his mouth was, for the first time since she had known him, not amused. She told him. She told him exactly. She did not soften the phrase about favour. She did not omit the moment in which the Earl had called her "my dear." She did not, however, repeat the small sentence about courtship, because she wanted to see what the Duke would do with the rest of it before he was given that particular gift. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she had finished, he was silent for a count of perhaps 10. Then he said, very quietly, "He came to your house." "He came to my house?" "He sat in your drawing room." "He did." "He used the word favour." "He did." "He used," said the Duke, "the word my dear." "How?" she asked, despite herself. "Did you guess that?" "I have known the Earl of Ashbourne," said the Duke of Ravenholm, "since I was 12 years old. He has called my mother my dear in a corner of a ballroom, and made my father, who was not, in general, a sensitive man, wish to call him out before supper. He has, in 3 drawing rooms in London that I know of, made a married woman cry by means of an endearment alone. He is a connoisseur of small humiliations. I am sorry he set one in your drawing room before I could put myself in its way." "You could not have put yourself in its way." "I could." "How?" "By being your husband." The morning room went very still. Cordelia looked at him. He did not look away. He did not, to his credit, blush, although there was a small movement at his throat that suggested he might have wished to. He simply held her gaze across the table and waited for her to say something. She did not say anything for a long moment. When she did, it was not the thing she had expected to say. "Your Grace," she said, "you are not, I think, in the habit of proposing in morning rooms." "I am not in the habit of proposing at all." "You have proposed once before." "I have not proposed once before. I asked, once, for a betrothal that my father had already arranged. I did not propose. I have, until this morning, not proposed in my life." "And this morning?" "This morning," he said, "I have not yet proposed. This morning I have observed, in passing, that the most useful instrument of protection I could offer you against a man like the Earl of Ashbourne would be my name, openly given. I have not offered it. I will not offer it except properly, and not in this room, and not on this errand. I do not, my lady, propose to a woman because an earl has been impertinent in her drawing-room. I propose to a woman because she has, for 4 mornings in succession, said useful things to me, which I had not heard from anyone else in 3 years, and because I have not, until I met her, understood what my brother was trying to do with the 3rd paragraph of a letter I had never read." He stopped. He drew breath. "I am not," he said, "proposing now." "Good. I am stating, however, but when I do propose, you will know the difference, and so will the Earl of Ashbourne." She lowered her eyes. She set her hands flat on the desk between them. The new gloves were a soft brown against the dark wood. "Your Grace," she said. "My lady. I have written to my husband's office. The papers are coming down on Friday. The instrument of appointment, the done letter, my husband's seal. We have a week before the inquiry. I think it would be wise if, during that week, you and I were seen in public twice. Once at the Assembly Room at Marland on Wednesday, once at the Hampshire Midsummer Breakfast at Lord Cunningham's on Saturday. Not riding, not alone. In rooms, with other people. I should like the gossip in London to be obliged, by Friday evening, to choose between calling me your mistress and conceding that it has nothing it can prove. I should like the Earl of Ashbourne to find that the bench at the inquiry is not as quiet a place as he had hoped." "You would risk your name." "My name," she said, "is not yet risked. The Earl has put it in the post. I should rather meet the letter at the door than wait for it to be delivered to a stranger." The Duke of Ravenholm sat back in his chair. His shoulders, which had been bunched, loosened. The small, unguarded line of his mouth came back. "My lady," he said, "you are formidable." "I am not. I am angry." "Anger of this temperature is formidable. Will you take my arm at Marland on Wednesday?" "I will." "Will you laugh at me, audibly, twice in the course of the evening?" "I shall, if you give me cause." "I shall give you cause." "I do not doubt it." He stood. He picked up his hat, which the parlour-maid had, by some discreet miracle, returned to the hall table while he had been speaking, and at the door he turned. "My lady." "Your Grace." "Whatever happens at the inquiry, whatever the Earl says, whatever the committee rules, whatever your office finds it must do, there is a thing I wish you to know." "What?" "I did not, when I came through your door the first morning, intend to find you. I had thought in advance of the letter and of nothing else. I have, in the course of 4 rides, and the cowslips, and the small economy of a pair of gloves, found you. I do not, today, know quite what to do about it. I wished to say so before Wednesday." He inclined his head and was gone. Cordelia did not stand from the desk for a long while. She sat with her hands flat on the wood, listening to the sound of the gelding going away down the lane, and after a moment, she lifted her left hand and looked at her wedding ring. James's ring, the small gold band she had worn for 7 years. And she turned it once on her finger, and she said, in the empty room, "All right, James. I shall do this properly. I shall do it properly." Then she rang for tea. She did not, in the days that followed, hurry. The post brought, on Thursday, a long, courteous note from Mr. Carstairs at Lincoln's Inn, confirming that the instrument and the Whitlock seal would travel down on Friday under his own escort, and that he had understood from her note that the Dunn letter would meet them in Hampshire. The post brought, on Friday, a small box from a London glover containing a second pair of fawn riding gloves, 2 sizes larger than the first, with a card that read only, "For winter, my lady." The post brought, on Saturday, an invitation from Lord Cunningham, in handwriting Cordelia had not seen for 3 years, asking her to attend his midsummer breakfast with such marked unfussiness that she understood, before she had read to the close, that the invitation was a deliberate act on Lord Cunningham's part, and that the Duke of Ravenholm had spent some part of Friday evening at Cunningham House himself. The garden, in those 4 days, did its own work. The hawthorn was at the high, white point of its season. The cuckoo had come back to the wood behind the parish. The brown mare, when ridden out alone, for the Duke kept, between the Tuesday and the Wednesday, a small, careful distance, as if to teach her that he was not, in fact, going to ride into her yard every morning of her life unless she invited it, was, by Friday evening, looking impatiently down the lane at every hour of dusk. Cordelia took, also, certain decisions. She wrote a long letter to her elder sister in Yorkshire, setting out, in plain prose, the events of the previous week, and ended the letter with the words, "If you find any part of this objectionable, please do not write back. If you find no part of it objectionable, you will hear from me again by the end of the month." She wrote a shorter letter to James's mother, in which she said only that she was well, that the office in Lincoln's Inn was sound, and that there was, in the affairs of the office, a small new matter that might in time require a small new decision. She had decided not, today, to set out the matter further. She wrote, last, a single line to the cottage of small Anne in Marland village. It said, "I shall, in time, send the freehold." She did not sign it. She rode out to the village herself in the late afternoon, slipped the note through the latch in the kitchen door, and rode back without dismounting. The Marland Assembly Room, on a Wednesday in late May, was not London. It was 40 couples, 3 musicians, 2 violinists who were almost in tune, a country dance master named Mr. Pence, who was, in his own opinion, the social conscience of the parish, and an unusually high concentration of cravats among the under-30s, on account of 3 militia officers having ridden over from the camp at Andover. It was, in short, a room in which the arrival of a duke was an event of the magnitude of a comet. Cordelia arrived first. She had decided, with Mrs. Fearing's quiet collusion, on the dark bronze silk with the small gold edging, which had been made the autumn before her husband's death and had never been worn. It was not a morning dress. It was not a ball gown. It was, very deliberately, the gown of a woman who had finished mourning by inches and was making, this evening, a declaration of a small inch more. She wore the Duke's mother's gloves. She wore, at her throat, a single string of pearls that had been her own mother's. She came in on the arm of her late husband's clerk, Mr. Carstairs, who had ridden down from Lincoln's Inn that afternoon with the papers, and who had, in a frock coat that was just on the edge of his daily wear, the bearing of a man who was determined not to disgrace his late employer. She made her 3 introductions. She accepted 3 condolences. She refused, with a smile that surprised the local matron offering it, the chair set aside for widows at the side wall. "I shall stand, Mrs. Pelham, thank you." "My dear, I shall stand." The Duke of Ravenholm came in at 20 minutes after 8. He came in alone, which set the room rustling. A duke without an entourage was, in Marland, a rarer beast than a duke with one. He came in evening dress, so plain that Mr. Pence, who had a small encyclopedia of London tailoring committed to memory, took 2 seconds to register the cut, and a third to register the value of it. He came in without looking, by any visible, deliberate act, for Cordelia. He bowed to Mrs. Pelham. He bowed to Mr. Pence. He shook the hand of the senior militia officer. He accepted a glass of bad punch from a footman and did not drink it. He inclined his head to the violinists, who flattered themselves the inclination was for them, and not for the small mercy that the second violin had finally tuned. Then, at a moment of his own choosing, he crossed the room. Cordelia watched him cross. She watched him with the attention with which one watched a horse one had bet on go down the course. The room watched her watch him. The room understood, in the very small, precise space of his approach, that something was being staged that the room would, later, need to have an opinion about. He stopped 2 paces from her, bowed properly, and offered his hand. "Lady Whitlock, I have been told that the second dance is to be a country dance. I should be obliged if you would lend it to me." "Your Grace, I have not danced since my husband's death." "Then you shall break the seal on dancing tonight. I have not danced since my brother's. We are, in this matter, well matched." "That is not an argument." "It is not. It is, however, an offer. Will you take it?" She put her gloved hand in his. The room, very quietly, began to find it had business to attend to in other parts of the room. They danced. They danced badly, in the way 2 people who had not danced for 3 and 7 years respectively danced. Too cautious, too proper, 3 half-beats behind the music, until at a certain point he muttered, under his breath, "Forgive me, my lady, but I cannot dance and be honest at the same time. And I shall be honest." And they began to dance, then, like 2 people who had decided, in the privacy of a country assembly room with 40 witnesses, to enjoy themselves. They laughed when she stepped on his foot. They laughed when he stepped on hers. They laughed, both at once, when Mr. Pence, the dance master, attempted, from the side of the room, a small, frowning correction of their angle, and they ignored him with a unanimity that Mr. Pence felt as a personal offence. When the dance ended, the Duke did not return her to Mrs. Pelham's circle. He stayed at her elbow. He fetched her a glass of punch, which they both, by a small mutual decision, did not drink. He listened, with grave courtesy, to the senior militia officer's account of the campaign in Belgium 2 years before, and asked one question at the end of it that made the officer say, later in the camp, that the Duke of Ravenholm was a man who, contrary to all London report, was capable of paying attention to another man for the length of a paragraph. He stood at Cordelia's shoulder while 2 of the local mothers introduced their daughters. He bowed to the daughters. He did not, at any point, look elsewhere. It was, in short, a faultless performance. And, because both of them were aware that it was a performance, it was also, by the end of the evening, something more. He had stood at her elbow for 3 hours. 3 hours was a great deal of time in which a person could, without intending to, find a habit forming. By the time the carriages were called, Cordelia knew the precise weight at which his hand rested at her back as they crossed a room. She knew the tone he used when he was actually amused, which was distinct from the tone he used when he was being polite. She knew, because he told her in passing during a lull near the supper table, that he had been afraid, that first morning, of 3 things: of being refused the letter, of being recognized as the Ravenholm whom certain of the Marland farmers had presumably heard rumors of, and of saying, in haste, something that would foreclose the possibility of a second visit. She knew, also, that he had been afraid more of the third than of the first 2. He had not put it that way, but he had not denied it when she observed it. The carriages were called at 11:30. The Duke handed her into Mr. Carstairs' hired chaise, for they had agreed, in advance, that he would not drive her home, and stood at the door, hat in hand, until the chaise pulled away. The last thing she saw, looking back through the small oval of the window, was him not yet moving from where he stood. In the chaise, Mr. Carstairs cleared his throat once.
My lady. Yes, Mr. Carstairs.
You danced twice with His Grace.
3 times. The 3rd time I assume you did not see because you were, at that moment, in conversation with the eldest Miss Pelham.
I see. My lady, I am bound, in honour of my late principal, to ask, is it understood between you and His Grace that
Mr. Carstairs?
My lady.
It is understood, she said,
looking out at the lane in the lantern light.
Between His Grace and me that, in 9 days there will be an inquiry. That, until that inquiry is settled, no understanding more particular than tonight's will be made or implied. And that, after the inquiry, His Grace and I shall sit down in a quiet room and decide whether there is to be one. That is what is understood. I tell you because you must, in 3 years, tell my son if there is one. James would have liked you to know.
Mr. Carstairs, in the dim light of the chaise, removed his spectacles, polished them with his handkerchief, and replaced them. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Carstairs.
They drove in silence the rest of the way home. The lantern at the front of the chaise made a small bright bell of light along the verge. A fox crossed the lane at the elbow before the rectory. The brown mare, hearing the wheels at the gate, called once from the field. Cordelia did not, on that night, sleep at once. She lay, instead, with her hand on the unread book at her bedside, and the small string of pearls back in its case on the dressing table. And she thought, with no particular hurry, about a country dance master named Mr. Pence. She thought also about the very small movement of a thumb against the back of her glove on a south lawn she had not yet seen. She thought about her late husband's clerk, polishing his spectacles in a chaise. She thought about a piece of cheese. She slept then. She dreamed of horses. In the morning, she rose before the household and walked, in her dressing gown, the length of the long border behind the kitchen garden, and counted the columbines. There were, by Saturday morning, a great many more of them than there had been on Thursday. Lord Cunningham's Saturday breakfast was a different animal. Conyngham House sat in 2,000 acres on the Hampshire Downs, with a south facade by Adam, a north terrace that took the wind off the chalk in winter and the sun in summer, and a host who had been a friend of the late Whitlock, and was, by genuine independent inclination, neither for the Earl of Ashbourne nor against the Duke of Ravenholm. 300 guests had been invited. 270 had said yes. The lawn east of the terrace was set with 8 long tables in linen and silver. There was a band. There was a string quartet near the Rose Walk. There was a marquee with iced champagne, and on a low table at the edge of the Rose Walk, a small heap of cards laid out for any guest who wished to write a private message to the host or hostess. The Earl of Ashbourne arrived at 11:30. The Duke of Ravenholm had arrived at 11 on the dot, in Lady Cunningham's own carriage from the house, for he had been a guest at Cunningham since Friday evening, by Lord Cunningham's stated and pointed invitation, and had spent the first half-hour with Lord Cunningham, the bishop's wife, and a Mr. Drummond from the city, who was understood to control a sufficient quantity of consols to make his opinion on the inquiry, were he to form one, a matter of weight. The bishop's wife had not until that morning had any direct conversation with the Duke of Ravenholm in her life. She found herself, by 20 minutes to 12, in possession of a story about an Italian opera singer and a runaway horse that she would, before the breakfast was over, retail to her sister, to 2 duchesses, and to the bishop himself. She would also, in the retelling, observe that the Duke was a man of unforced manners, considerable wit, and unmistakable grief, and that she did not, on reflection, see how a man with so much grief in his face could have hurried his own brother into a coffin. The bishop's wife was a serious woman. Her opinion travelled. Cordelia arrived at 5 minutes to 12. She came in a small open carriage of her own, with Mrs. Ferring on the box and Mr. Carstairs on the rumble, in the same dark bronze silk she had worn at Marland on Wednesday, for she had decided, with the cold reasoning that had carried her through 7 months, that she would not be seen this week in 3 different gowns, and that wearing the bronze again would say to London that she was not dressing for the Duke, but for the inquiry. She wore the Duke's mother's gloves. She wore her own pearls. She brought with her, in a small lacquered box on the seat beside her, the instrument of appointment under her late husband's seal, which she had decided, that morning, she would not let out of her possession until the door of the committee room closed behind her. Lord Cunningham met her at the gravel. "Lady Whitlock."
"My lord?"
"You honour me."
"You are kind, sir."
"I am not, in this case. I have a small introduction to make." He took her arm. He walked her, slowly, with the deliberate pace of a host who had a thing to do before luncheon, around the rose walk and across the terrace and onto the lawn, where, with no apparent design, he placed her in the small ring of 3 persons that consisted of the bishop's wife, a Mr. Drummond from the city, and the Duke of Ravenholme. The bishop's wife greeted her warmly. Mr. Drummond bowed deeply. The Duke of Ravenholme took her gloved hand for the briefest possible moment that civility allowed, and did not raise it to his lips, and did not let her see, although she saw, the very small movement of his thumb against the back of her glove before he released her. "Mrs. Ridley," said Lord Cunningham. "Mr. Drummond, you are already acquainted with his grace. Lady Whitlock, may I present you to Mrs. Ridley, who is the bishop's wife, and to Mr. Drummond of Lombard Street. Lady Whitlock," he added, with the very small smile of a man placing a card face up on a table, "is the widow of the late James Whitlock, K.C., of Lincoln's Inn, on whom his Grace's late brother, on the day before his death, dictated the only letter of his last illness." The bishop's wife inclined her head with a depth that left the matter, for the bishop's wife, settled. Mr. Drummond bowed again. The Duke of Ravenholme bowed. The ring of 4 stood for some little time on the lawn together, and the Earl of Ashbourne, arriving on the gravel at 11:30, observed the ring from a distance of 40 yards across the terrace, and understood, in the very small, precise unfolding of his understanding, that something had been done by Cunningham to him personally before he had set foot on the lawn. He came across anyway. He was a man who did not retreat from a maneuver he had been about to execute simply because the ground beneath it had been moved. He bowed to Lord Cunningham. He bowed to the bishop's wife. He bowed, with a particular economy, to Mr. Drummond. He turned, then, to Cordelia and to the Duke. "Lady Whitlock."
"My lord."
"Your Grace." "Ashbourne. You are well, I trust, the both of you?"
"As well as the season permits,"
said Cordelia, returning his own phrase to him without a smile.
"And you, my lord?"
"I am, my dear, troubled." The bishop's wife, who had a memory, and was at this moment running through it, became very still. "My dear Mrs. Ridley," said the Earl, turning to her with a small, confidential lean, "I do not suppose I shall be the only person at Cunningham today to remark on the very particular pleasure of seeing Lady Whitlock and his Grace of Ravenholme in such, as it were, sociable conversation. Will you forgive me, I am of the older generation, if I observe that, in my own youth, a recent widow would not, under any circumstances, have been seen?"
"My lord,"
said the bishop's wife,
"you will forgive me if I, who am also of the older generation, observe that in my youth a gentleman would not, under any circumstances, have introduced into a host's lawn a sentence that the gentleman did not intend to finish. Please finish the sentence."
There was, on the lawn east of the terrace at Cunningham House, a small, audible drawing of breath. Lord Cunningham, who had a face capable of an extraordinary impassivity, examined a chestnut tree in the middle distance. Mr. Drummond, who had not, in 20 years, been present at a piece of social bloodletting at this caliber, decided in the same moment that he would, on Monday morning, at his Lombard Street counting-house, find himself unable to act against any party currently in Lord Cunningham's south lawn. The Earl of Ashbourne, with an effort it took Cordelia a second to admire, smiled. "You correct me, Mrs. Ridley. I had intended to observe only that recent widows, in my youth, were not seen at breakfasts. I had not meant my observation to extend further. I beg, Lady Whitlock, your pardon."
"You have it, my lord."
"You are gracious."
"I am polite."
She held his eye for the count of 3. The Earl looked away first. Then, in a tone so quiet that only the 4 of them in the ring caught it, the Duke of Ravenholm spoke. "Ashbourne, Your Grace, on Wednesday next, you will sit in the chair of an inquiry of which I am the principal subject. I shall, on that morning, be in court at 10 precisely with my counsel, with my late brother's letter, with my late brother's seal, with Lady Whitlock's instrument of appointment, and with Lady Whitlock, who has agreed to attend. You will, I am sure, conduct that inquiry in the manner the House requires. I shall, equally, expect that you do not, between this morning and that, make any further private call upon any private widow in this kingdom. If you should, I shall come and meet you in her drawing-room. I shall come, I assure you, civilly. Do we, Ashbourne, understand each other?" The Earl of Ashbourne did not, for a long moment, reply. When he did, it was to Mrs. Ridley. "Mrs. Ridley, your servant. Lord Cunningham. Lady Whitlock. Your Grace." He bowed to each of them in order. He did not, this time, bow last to the Duke. He turned. He walked back toward the gravel, and his small grey figure became, between the chestnut trees, indistinguishable from any other gentleman of late middle age, leaving a country breakfast a little earlier than he had intended. Lord Cunningham allowed his face to admit a small private amusement. "Mrs. Ridley," he said. "Champagne."
"Champagne, Lord Cunningham."
"Mr. Drummond." "My lord." "You will, I trust, sit at my table at the head." "I shall, my lord, sit wherever I am put." "Excellent. Lady Whitlock, your Grace, I shall leave you to walk a little in the rose walk. The roses, you will find, are not yet out, but the box hedges are extremely well shaped. Until luncheon, then." He went. The bishop's wife, in passing, touched Cordelia's elbow once, very lightly, and said, without looking at her, "My dear, that is a fine gown." Cordelia and the Duke of Ravenholm were left, as Lord Cunningham had intended, on the lawn alone. They walked into the rose walk. The roses were not yet out. The box hedges were very well shaped. "My lady," said the Duke, when they had gone 20 paces between the hedges, and the sound of the breakfast had become a small, distant pleasantness. "I owe you, for that, an apology."
"For what?"
"For threatening a man in your presence."
"He had threatened me," she said. "In mine. We are even."
"We are not even. I should have allowed Mrs. Ridley to finish him."
"Mrs. Ridley had finished him. You were redundant. But," she added, "I forgive the redundancy."
"You are merciful."
"I am efficient."
He laughed in the rose walk, with no audience. They walked on. At the far end, where the walk turned at right angles into the herb garden, he stopped and turned to face her. He took off his hat. He set it on the low stone wall. "My lady, your Grace. On Wednesday next, after the inquiry, regardless of its outcome."
"Yes."
"I should like to call on you in your morning room, in mud or out of it. I should like to ask you a question. I should like to ask it in the presence of Mrs. Ferring, who appears to be the head of your household in all matters of the heart. I should like the question to be unhurried. I should like the answer, whatever it is, to be unhurried also."
"You are taking lessons in unhurriedness, your Grace."
"I am being instructed by a stern teacher."
"You are doing well."
"That is the highest praise I have had from you."
"You shall have higher in time, if you continue to deserve it."
"I shall." He looked at her for a moment longer. She let him. Then he picked up his hat, offered her his arm, and they walked back, in unhurried silence, down the rose walk to the lawn, where 266 guests were now, with great delicacy, not watching them at all. On the Wednesday of the inquiry, it rained. It rained slowly, the kind of late May rain that the gardens needed, and the road into the Lords did not. Cordelia, in the Whitlock town carriage, with Mr. Carstairs, and the small lacquered box between them, watched the rain on the window and thought about her husband. James, on the day of his largest case, had been sick in a basin in the carriage all the way to Westminster, and had still stood up in court an hour later and broken the Welby ring with one cross-examination of a Liverpool shipping clerk. She had not been sick. She did not feel sick. She felt, instead, the particular clear, cold edge of a morning on which a thing one had imagined was about to become a thing one was inside of. The Duke of Ravenholm met them at the door of the Lords. He was in dark grey. He had not slept. He took her hand at the carriage step and held it, in front of 3 witnesses, for a half a second too long for ordinary courtesy, and a half a second short of impropriety. He nodded to Mr. Carstairs. He led them, by a small private corridor known to dukes, to the committee room. The committee room was full. The Earl of Ashbourne was in the chair. 5 other peers sat in a half ring. A clerk sat at a small table to the side with a thick ledger and 3 pens. Counsel for the Duke, a Mr. Henwood, K.C., of an age and bearing that suggested he had bullied judges since before the Earl of Ashbourne had been born, stood at a small lectern on the left. Counsel for the committee, a thin, sharp man named Mr. Talent, stood at a lectern on the right. Behind a low rail, on 3 rows of chairs, sat a public of perhaps 30. Journalists, peers' wives, 2 friends of the Duke from the Lords, a small contingent from the Inns of Court, and, at the very back, in a hat that did not quite hide her face, the bishop's wife. The Earl of Ashbourne, when Cordelia entered, did not immediately look up. He let her stand for perhaps a count of 4. Then, with the small smile of a man who had decided that the ground beneath his feet had not been moved as much as he had feared on Saturday, he inclined his head. Lady Whitlock. My lord. You will, I think, take the seat at the witness rail. With your Grace's permission, I shall take the seat after Mr. Carstairs has presented the instrument. That is for the committee to direct. With respect, my lord, that is for the Whitlock office to direct, in the matter of its own instrument. Mr. Talent, the committee counsel, who had been about to rise, paused with one hand on the lectern. The Earl of Ashbourne, with the smallest of pauses, inclined his head a second time. Very well. Mr. Carstairs. Mr. Carstairs stepped forward. He laid the lacquered box on the clerk's table. He opened it, slowly, with a small brass key that he had carried all morning on a chain around his neck. He removed 3 items. The first was the Whitlock seal, which he laid on the table. The second was Edmund's letter, which he laid beside the seal. The third was a smaller, folded paper, sealed in red wax, the instrument of appointment, which he laid in the centre. He stood. My lords, he said, in the careful, clear voice of a clerk who had practiced this speech on the way down from Lincoln's Inn. By the direction of my late principal, James Whitlock, King's Counsel, deceased, and pursuant to the dying instructions of Edmund Avery, late 8th Earl of Ravenholm, deceased, I lay before this committee the 3 articles of the Ravenholm contingent estates. The Dunn letter, being the letter of Edmund Avery to my late principal of the 6th of April, 1814. The Whitlock seal, being the seal under which the instrument of appointment was sealed in October of 1816. The instrument of appointment, being the instrument by which my late principal, James Whitlock, exercised the discretion conferred upon him by the Dunn letter, and named, in his sole and undelegable discretion, the person in whom the discretion thereafter vested. My lords, the instrument is to be read. He bowed. He sat. A small silence settled in the committee room. The Earl of Ashbourne, with a movement of perhaps half an inch, leaned forward in his chair. "Read it." Cordelia rose. She did not look at the Duke. She did not look at the public. She walked to the clerk's table. She broke the red wax seal with the small mother-of-pearl knife Mr. Carstairs had laid beside it. She unfolded the paper, smoothed it once with the side of her hand, and read aloud. She read in a voice that did not shake. "I, James Whitlock, of Lincoln's Inn, being of sound mind, and on the 3rd day before my death, exercised the discretion conferred upon my office by the done letter of Edmund Avery, late 8th Earl of Ravenholm. I name, as the person in whom that discretion is henceforth to vest, my wife, Cordelia Ann Whitlock. I do so for the following reasons, which I am bound, by the terms of the done letter, to set forth. First, that I have known her for 15 years, and have not, in those years, seen her err in any matter of judgment that touched another person's good. Second, that the late Earl of Ravenholm, in conversation with me at Oxford in 1805, expressed to me his particular regret that he had not, in life, met her. Third, that the discretion, as I read it, is not a discretion of property merely, but a discretion of friendship. And fourth, that I have no greater confidence in any other living person. Sealed under my hand and the Whitlock seal, this 3rd day of October, 1816, James Whitlock. She set the instrument down. The Earl of Ashbourne, after a moment, said, "Lady Whitlock." "My lord." "You hold, then, by the operation of this instrument, the disposition of the contingent estates of Ravenholm?" "I do." "Do you intend, at this committee or elsewhere, to disclose the manner in which you propose to exercise that disposition?" "I do." A small movement at the back of the room. The bishop's wife, leaning very slightly forward. "At this committee," said Cordelia. "At this hour. With the indulgence of the chair, and not before reading, with my lord's permission, the 2nd paragraph of the done letter, which has not yet, by any party, been read into the record." The Earl of Ashbourne hesitated. It was the only thing he could have done that mattered. He had no good objection. The done letter was the foundational document of the entire matter. It had been laid before the committee. The committee had not yet heard it read. He could not, without giving the visible appearance of refusing to hear evidence the committee had itself convened to hear, refuse her. "Read it." She read. She read it slowly. She read the line about the wasting illness in Edmund's hand. She read the line about the disposition of the contingent estates. She read, then, in a voice that went deliberately, very gentle, the 3rd paragraph, the one she had not, until this morning, read aloud to anyone. "Whitlock, if your wife is the woman you have described, and I think she is, then before she signs any instrument disposing of the contingent estates, my brother is to know her, and she is to know my brother. I do not insist on a marriage. I insist on a friendship. Sebastian has never had a friend who told him no. Find him one. Find me one. I am very tired." She lowered the page. She looked at the half-ring of peers. "My lords," she said, "it is my opinion, after 7 mornings of acquaintance, and 1 assembly-room dance, and 1 breakfast on Lord Cunningham's lawn, that the late Earl of Ravenholm has been obeyed in the matter of friendship. I tell my lords this plainly, because the late Earl of Ravenholm tied the disposition of his contingent estates to a friendship. I am, therefore, prepared to exercise the disposition. I exercise it as follows." She turned. She lifted the instrument from the table. She held it out to the clerk. "I assign, this day, the contingent estates of Marland, Halford, and the small island farm at Rye to be reunited, in fee simple, with the dukedom of Ravenholm, to be held by the present Duke of Ravenholm and his heirs, on 1 condition only." "What condition?" said the Earl of Ashbourne. "That the present Duke of Ravenholm, before the close of this session, shall stand before this committee, and shall, in his own words, ask of me, in friendship, that I sign. That is the discretion. That is the condition. Those are the terms. There was, in the committee room, a very long silence. Mr. Henwood, K.C., counsel for the Duke, looked at the Duke. The Duke of Ravenholm rose. He did not walk to a lectern. He walked instead to where Cordelia stood at the clerk's table. He stopped 1 pace from her. He removed, very slowly, his right glove. He laid the glove on the table beside the instrument. He went down, in the committee room of the House of Lords, on 1 knee. The Earl of Ashbourne, in his chair, made a small sound that was not, strictly, a word. The bishop's wife, at the back of the room, did not breathe. The Duke of Ravenholm looked up at Cordelia from 1 knee, in the committee room of the House of Lords, in the presence of 5 peers, 2 counsel, a clerk, 30 members of the public, the press of 3 London papers, and the bishop's wife. And he said, in the voice that she had heard him use once before on horseback at the river, when he had said he had not, in 3 years, laughed in the presence of a woman who was not paid to make him laugh. Lady Whitlock. Cordelia. Your Grace. I have, since the morning I first stood in your study and ordered you to give me a letter, learned 3 things. I have learned that the letter was not, in fact, what I had come for. I have learned that my brother, in leaving, gave me a gift I was not, at the time, fit to receive. I have learned that I am, now, fit to receive it, because a widow of Hampshire has, in the course of 4 rides, 2 dances, 1 rose walk, and the lending of a pair of my mother's gloves, make me fit. He drew in 1 careful breath. The committee room held it with him. I do not ask today for the contingent estates. I ask for the friendship. I ask in the form my brother required. I ask publicly because privately, it appears, I am not, even now, in the habit of asking. Cordelia. I am, on 1 knee, in a room I do not normally kneel in, asking. If you would, in friendship, sign. Sign. If you would, in friendship, refuse. Refuse. If you would, in friendship, take a year. Take it. I shall wait. A floorboard somewhere under the gallery shifted under a journalist's weight. No one looked up. I am, this morning, in possession of 1 piece of information which I shall make plain. Whatever the disposition of the contingent estates, whatever the verdict of this committee, whatever the judgment of London, I am, from this morning on, your friend, and your servant, and, if you will permit it, in time, more. I shall not, today, ask more. I ask, today, in friendship. Sign or do not. Beg you, I do. He stopped. He waited. The Earl of Ashbourne, in the chair, did not move. The bishop's wife, at the back, lifted a small handkerchief very carefully to the corner of her eye. Mr. Drummond, of Lombard Street, who had come to the committee room out of pure curiosity, made a small note in his memorandum book that he would, later that afternoon, share with 2 of his partners. Cordelia looked down at the Duke of Ravenholm on his knee in front of her in a committee room of the Lords. She did not, this time, hesitate. She had not, in fact, intended to hesitate. She lifted the instrument from the table, dipped Mr. Carstairs' pen, which Mr. Carstairs, in a very small private grace, had laid ready, in the inkpot, and signed her name across the bottom of the instrument in a hand so steady it surprised her. She set the pen down. She held out her right hand to the Duke of Ravenholm. Your Grace, she said. Stand up. He stood up. She placed her right hand in his. The committee room, at the back, near the door, made a small, unmistakable sound that was, when later asked, denied by every person who had been present. It had, on description, been the sound of 200 years of London air going out of a room at once and coming back in, faintly, perfumed with cowslip. The Earl of Ashburn and his chair rallied. "My lords," he said, that is, the committee will adjourn. The instrument will be entered in the record. The committee's verdict on the broader question of the late Earl's death will be delivered, by leave, in 2 days. Lady Whitlock, Your Grace, you may withdraw." They withdrew. In the small private corridor known to dukes, halfway between the committee room and the side door, the Duke of Ravenholm stopped. He set down the lacquered box. He took her gloved hand. He raised it, this time, properly, to his lips. He looked up at her over her own knuckles, with an expression she would, for the rest of her life, when she was alone and needed it, return to in her own private rooms, in her own private mind. "My lady, Your Grace, I have, in friendship, asked. I have not yet, in love, asked." "You shall," she said, "in love, ask. Not today." "Not today." "On Friday." "On Friday." "In my morning room." "In your morning room." "In the presence of Mrs. Ferring." "In the presence of Mrs. Ferring." "Out of mud." "Out of mud, my lady. I give you my word." She laughed, and the corridor of the House of Lords, which had, in 5 centuries, heard a great many laughs of a great many varieties, accepted this one without comment. They went out into the small grey afternoon. The rain had stopped. On the Friday, he came at 11. He was out of mud. He was in clean boots. He had not brought a book. He had brought, instead, his late mother's wedding ring, which was a small, thin band of gold with a single small pearl, and he carried it all morning in a closed left fist, until, in the morning room of the Whitlock house in Hampshire, in the presence of Mrs. Ferring, who had positioned herself in the doorway with such transparent intention that the cat had had to climb over her ankles to get out, in the presence of Mr. Carstairs, who had ridden down from London the night before by his own contrivance, and in the presence of the brown mare, who could be heard, beyond the window, deciding that the gelding in the yard was, on balance, an acceptable companion. He asked, in love, and Cordelia, who had decided in advance what answer she would give, gave it. The proposal had been intended, by him, to be brief. It became long. It became long because she set conditions, and he listened to them. That her late husband's office should be kept on by him on a retainer, for any private legal matter touching either estate, in perpetuity. That the cottager Anne's family should be given, in the autumn, the freehold of the small cottage in which they currently rented 2 rooms. That the second largest piece of cheese at supper should, for the rest of his natural life, be considered hers. That, on the matter of being ordered in the morning room, he should consider himself permanently and unconditionally forbidden. And that, when in 15 or 20 years from this Friday, they should sit at a small breakfast table together, with a brown-haired child between them, the Dunn letter should be read aloud over the breakfast, in its entirety, in the presence of the child. That the child should know what its Uncle Edmund had been to its mother, and to its father, and to all of them. He accepted each. He set conditions in return, 3 only. That she should, in due course, learn the value of a small economy. That she should, in due course, accept the second pair of his mother's gloves, which were heavier and intended for winter. That she should, on the morning following the wedding, ride out with him by the river at the hour she would, if left to herself, have ridden alone, because he had decided, sometime between the assembly room at Marland and the Rose Walk at Cunningham, that he did not, in his life, want to ride that hour alone again. She accepted each. Mrs. Ferring, at the door, said quietly, "Bread and cheese, my lady." "Bread and cheese, please, Mrs. Ferring." "The largest piece for his grace, my lady." "The second largest, Mrs. Ferring." "Very good, my lady." The cat returned. Mrs. Ferring brought the bread. The Duke ate 1 slice, and a piece of cheese the size of a small book. He did not, that day, leave until 4. When at last he rode away down the lane, The brown mare watched him to the bend of the road. Cordelia did not, that afternoon, walk in the garden. She sat instead at her writing desk and made a list of things she would need at the parish wedding office before the day. The list was long. She enjoyed the making of it. Mrs. Ferring, behind her, beat eggs without comment. The kitchen, in the late spring afternoon, smelled of yeast and of cut chives. The brown mare, in the field, lay down in the long grass. The hawthorn, on the lane, dropped its last petals. In London, the Earl of Ashbourne, in his library, did not write to his sister at Bath until Tuesday. By Wednesday, the news of the Lord's inquiry had reached 3 drawing rooms and 4 clubs, and by Friday it had reached, by way of the bishop's wife, the breakfast tables of every consequential household in 2 counties. By Saturday, Cordelia and the Duke of Ravenholm were, in the public account of all the morning's papers, engaged. They had not, by Saturday, told anyone. They told Mrs. Ferring first. Mrs. Ferring, on hearing, said only, "I had heard, my lady. I had heard from the parish." "From whom in the parish, Mrs. Ferring?" "From the cottager Anne, my lady, who had it from her mother, who had it from a tinker at the gate. The roads of Hampshire are quick." "They are quick, Mrs. Ferring. They are also, in this case, my lady, correct." She said the last with a small, dry smile that, for Mrs. Ferring, was the equivalent of an embrace. They were married at Marland Church on the 28th of June by Mrs. Ridley's husband, the bishop, who had insisted, with a firmness Cordelia had not had the heart to refuse, on officiating personally. The bride wore the dark bronze silk of the assembly and the breakfast, on the principle that London had now seen the gown and was at peace with it. The bridegroom wore his late father's coat, which fit, with a small, unobtrusive alteration of the shoulders. Lord Cunningham gave the bride away. Mr. Carstairs read the lesson. Mrs. Ferring sat in the second pew, weeping with such silent dignity that the bishop, who had baptized a great many infants and married a great many couples and buried a great many fathers, found himself observing afterwards to his wife that, of the 3 classes of weeping he distinguished in his ministry, Mrs. Ferring's was of the rare first kind, which was the kind that did not require comfort. The wedding breakfast was small. The cowslips, Anne of Marland insisted on bringing in a fistful through the church gate, were taken by Cordelia at the carriage step and tucked, again, into the throat of the bronze silk. The brown mare, in honour of the day, did not throw the new shoe Mrs. Ferring had been afraid she would throw. The Earl of Ashbourne, in London, did not, on that morning, attend any function in society. The committee's verdict on the broader matter of the late Earl of Ravenholm's death had, in fact, been delivered the previous Friday, in terms so unequivocally exonerating that the Duke of Ravenholm had, 3 hours after their issue, written, in his own hand, the only personal letter the Earl of Ashbourne would receive from him in either of their lives. A letter consisting of 1 sentence. "I do not propose, my lord, to wait for an apology," and an address. The Earl had not, on receiving it, replied. The Earl had, instead, sat in his library for 2 hours, and had then, with the slow dignity of a man recognizing a defeat at the only altar at which his pride could not refuse to bow, written to his sister at Bath that he would, in the summer, take the waters there. They went, for their wedding journey, no further than the small island farm at Rye. It was the 3rd of the contingent estates, the smallest of them, and the one Edmund had loved in life with the particular love of a younger son for a piece of property no one else in the family had ever wanted. The farmhouse stood on a hard knot of chalk above the salt marsh. The roof was old red tile. The garden, in late June, was a flat green rectangle, full of plain, sturdy roses that some long-ago tenant had planted for company, and that no one, in 30 years, had thought to remove. There was a single elm at the gate. There was a black and white sheepdog who came up to the bride on the first morning and laid his head against her skirt with no introduction, and was, by the second morning, sleeping at the foot of her bed as if the matter had been settled by an older authority than either of them. They stayed at Rye for 14 days. They walked the marsh in the mornings,
They ate plain food in the kitchen with the farm couple who had been at Rye since before Edmund was born. The Duke of Ravenholm, on the 7th morning, took down from the parlour shelf the small, worn copy of Donne's sermons, which his brother had kept in this house when they had been boys, and read aloud, in the parlour with the sheepdog asleep across his boots, the sermon on the 7th of the 7 trumpets. Cordelia, on the bench by the fire, listened with her hands quiet in her lap and her eyes on the marsh through the small, low window. And at the end she said only, "Thank you. Read it again next year." He read it again next year. He read it, in the event, every year of his marriage, on or about the same date, in the same parlour, with one or another sheepdog and one or another small child in the room. And the habit, like the columbines in Cordelia's old kitchen garden, planted itself. On the last morning at Rye, before the carriage came up to the gate, they walked once more out onto the chalk above the marsh. The day was high and clear. A long line of gulls went over toward Dungeness. Cordelia stood with her hand on the gate and watched them. The Duke of Ravenholm watched her. He had, in the last fortnight, begun to discover that watching her at the gate of a small chalk farm at the end of England was an occupation that did not, in any visible respect, tire him. "My lady." "Your Grace?" "You are smiling." "I am counting gulls." "How many?" 11, then 12. The last is in dispute." "The last," he said, "is yours. I award it." "I do not need it awarded." "I award it anyway. It is the small economy of the morning. I am, as ever, a man of small economies." She laughed at him. The gull, as if hearing himself contested, took a long, slow turn back over the marsh and rejoined his line. She lost count. She did not start again. She turned instead and walked back to the farmhouse with the Duke of Ravenholm at her side and the sheepdog ahead of them in the long grass. And the day, which had felt, when it began, like the closing edge of a season, felt instead like the very first morning of a new one. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenholm, on the morning after they returned to Hampshire from Rye, rode out by the river at the hour Cordelia would, if left to herself, have ridden alone. She did not ride alone again. 6 months later, in the very last week of November, on the south terrace at Cunningham House, for they were back at Cunningham at Lord Cunningham's pointed invitation, on the occasion of a small dinner to mark the recent passage of a reform bill in which the Duke of Ravenholm had taken, by the bishop's wife's own account, a remarkable share of the spoken work. Cordelia, Duchess of Ravenholm, stood at the rail in a deep teal cloak, with her gloved hand on the stone, and watched the early dusk come down over the chalk. She was 3 months with child. She had not yet told anyone except Mrs. Ferring, who had guessed before she had. She was thinking, very calmly, with no particular hurry, about the shape of the next year. A hand settled at her back. She did not turn. "Your Grace." "My lady." "You are not yet dressed for dinner." "I am minutes from being dressed." "You will be late." "I shall be late together with you, in which case our hosts will accept it." He came to stand beside her at the rail. He was, after 6 months, a man whose face she knew with an exactness that surprised her every morning when she saw him asleep. He was, she had come to understand, also a man who had, in the last 6 months, said more useful things in any given week than he had said in any given year of the previous 25. "My love," he said. "Your Grace, you are smiling." "I am thinking about Edmund." "Tell me." "I was thinking that he, on his last day, asked Mr. Whitlock to find you a friend. He did not, that I recall, specify the duration." "He did not." "I am, on consideration, prepared to find you a friend in perpetuity." "Lady Whitlock, that is no longer my name, Your Grace." "It is in my mind, occasionally. It is the name in which I learned to ask. You have learned the asking very well. Have I? Yes. She turned her head and looked at him. The light off the chalk lay along the bones of his face in the way she had known, even in May, that it would one day lie. He looked down at her in the way she had known, even in May, that he would one day look. Inside the house, behind the long windows, the candles for dinner were being lit. The bishop's wife, somewhere in the gallery, was laughing. "My lord," said Cordelia, very softly. "My lady, I shall in the spring be unable to ride out by the river at the hour we ride. I shall ride for both of us." "You shall." "And then in the autumn?" "In the autumn." "In the autumn." "Yes." "I shall," he said, "read the Dunn letter to her." "To her or to him?" "To her or to him." "In her or his hearing?" "In her or his hearing. In yours, in Mrs. Ferring's, in Mr. Carstairs, in, by the providence of God, my brother's, wherever he is." "In Edmund's." "In Edmund's." They stood at the rail of the south terrace at Cunningham House while the last of the November light went out over the chalk downs. He kept his hand on her back. She kept her hand on the stone. The rooks went over the wood toward the river in a long, ragged line, and the bishop, in the dining room behind them, decided not, on this occasion, to send anyone to call them in. When at last they turned and walked, slowly, with the unhurried pace of two people who had taught each other unhurriedness, back toward the long windows and the candles, Cordelia heard herself laughing once at something he had not yet said, and the Duke of Ravenholm, hearing her laugh, observed in a tone of complete satisfaction, "My lady, you have this evening laughed before I have been amusing. I shall, in time, catch up." "Catch up, then?" "I shall." He did. There are, in any long marriage, certain small images one keeps in a drawer of the mind, to be taken out on the dim evenings. Cordelia had hers. She had the small white scar near his temple, which she had first noticed in her morning room over cold beef. She had the brown mare's ears twitched forward on a lane in May. She had the cowslips in the throat of a bronze silk. She had the cottager Anne at the gate with her fistful of yellow. She had the dance master, Mr. Pence, attempting from the side of the assembly room a correction of an angle. She had the bishop's wife, behind a small handkerchief, in a courtroom of the Lords. She had the second largest piece of cheese on a small blue plate. She had the gulls over the marsh at Rye, 11 and 12, and 1 in dispute. She had the sound of the bishop saying the words at Marland Church on a hot afternoon in late June. She had the elm at the gate of the small island farm. She had Mrs. Ferring's eggs, beaten to a yellow froth at 8:30. She had the smell of hawthorn on a high field on a morning in late spring. She had the look on the Earl of Ashbourne's face when he had been asked to finish his sentence. She had the Dunn letter on the parlour shelf at Rye, with the third paragraph turned out at the corner. She had the small, careful sound of the Duke's voice when he had said her Christian name for the first time in the corridor of the Lords. She had a great many other things. She did not, in her life, write them down. She did not, in her life, need to. The drawer was sufficient. In the spring, as she had told him, she did not ride out by the river. The Duke of Ravenholm rode for both of them on the gelding at the hour. He came back on each morning in time to read to her at the breakfast table from the London papers, which was, by her account, a more useful contribution to married life than poetry. In the autumn, in October, a small, dark-haired girl was born at Ravenholm House, to a great deal less drama than her mother had been promised by every woman in the parish. She was named Edmunda. She was called, in the household, Eddie. She was, in due season, joined by a brother, whom the household, with a small private agreement among themselves,
did not call after his father. He was named James, after a barrister of Lincoln's Inn, whom none of them but his mother had known, and the brown mare, who lived to be 28, taught him to sit a saddle on her own back at the age of 3. The Dunn letter was read by the Duke of Ravenholm to his daughter at the breakfast table at Rye in her 5th summer, with the sheepdog asleep across his boots and his wife on the bench opposite with a small piece of toast in her hand. The 3rd paragraph was read last. Eddie heard it through. She did not, for some time, speak. Then she said, "Papa, did you obey him?" "I obeyed him." "Why?" "Because, my dear, he had told me, in the only way he could, that he was, in his last week, looking after me. I do not, in life, often allow myself to be looked after. I allowed him." "Was Mamma, then, a gift?" "Mamma was a gift. Mamma is also, in her own person, the woman I came to your grandfather's solicitor's house in Hampshire on a Tuesday in May to demand a letter from. She is not a gift only. She is, in addition, the woman who, when I demanded the letter, told me to beg." "You begged?" "I did. I am told I learned." "Mamma, was Papa a gift?" Cordelia, on the bench, set down the small piece of toast. She looked at her husband across the kitchen table at Rye, in the room in which his brother had loved a sermon, with their daughter between them, and the sheepdog snoring, and the gulls over the marsh. And she said, very gently, "Papa was a gift. Papa was also, in his own person, the man who had been, for 3 years before I met him, told he was something he was not. He was a gift, my Eddie. He was also a man your mother had to insist on. They are not the same thing. But they are not, on consideration, different things. Both. Both, my dear." Eddie thought about it. She accepted it. She got down from the chair, climbed up onto the sheepdog, who tolerated her, and went out into the marsh to look for the gull, which had, in her father's account, been disputed. Cordelia and the Duke of Ravenholm sat at the kitchen table at Rye for some time without speaking. The kettle, on the hob, talked instead. The Duke's eyes did not, for that long time, leave his wife's face. She did not look away. In the small drawer of her mind, she added, very gently, the morning's particular light off the marsh. She closed the drawer. She opened it in the years that followed, very often. If you have stayed by the fire this long, if you have ridden with us as far as Marland, and waited with us in the morning rooms, and stood with us at the Cummingham rail in the November dusk, and walked with us on the chalk above the marsh at Rye, then you have given a story the most generous gift a story can be given, which is your patience for one more turn of it. Tell me, in the comments, the line you would have made him beg with. Subscribe if you would care to sit by the fire with me again. And until the next telling, sleep well.